Somewhere in the heart of Africa, amidst the whispers of twilight, you linger by the fire, the comforting embrace of your village offering solace after another day's toil. But as the shadows lengthen, a sense of unease settles over your settlement, a premonition of impending danger that flickers in the corner of your mind. Suddenly, the tranquility is shattered by the chilling war cries of an enemy tribe, their ferocious onslaught tearing through the peace like a storm unleashed. Caught off guard in the dead of night, your village becomes a battleground, the chaos of combat engulfing everything in its path. Amidst the chaos and confusion, you find yourself seized by rough hands, your desperate struggles futile against the overwhelming force of your captors. Fast forward, bound and bewildered, you find yourself in a line of fellow captives. The flickering flames of your once peaceful home are now a distant memory as you begin your forced march across the treacherous expanse of the Sahara to a slave market in North Africa. The Arab slave trade, sometimes referred to as the Trans-Saharan slave trade, was the historical practice of trading slaves predominantly taken from sub-Saharan Africa across the vast Sahara Desert and beyond. This dark practice primarily involved Arab and Berber merchants with help from various sub-Saharan African kingdoms. Despite the focus on the transatlantic slave trade in modern times, this trade actually predates the transatlantic slave trade by several centuries and continued well into the 20th century. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily transported slaves to the Americas, the Arab slave trade predominantly supplied slaves to markets in North Africa, in modern-day Algeria, Tunisia and Libya, and the Middle East and even parts of Asia. The Arab slave trade was characterized by its extensive reach, spanning from regions in Africa where captives were often obtained through raids, warfare, or as captives of debt, to destinations across the Mediterranean, Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean. Estimates of the total number of black slaves moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world ranged from around 6 to 10 million. Wild. It would go on to have significant social, economic, and cultural implications for both the African societies affected by it and the regions where slaves were eventually sold. But let's start by quickly looking at the origins of this barbaric practice. Evidence of slave trading and transportation across the Sahara stretches back to ancient times, with historical records dating as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, notably during the reign of Egyptian pharaoh Sneferu. Sneferu's expedition into what is now modern-day Sudan signify early instances of capturing slaves and transporting them north. These endeavors comprised of raids aimed at acquiring prisoners of war who were then subjected to enslavement. Such practices were widespread not only in ancient Egypt, but also throughout Africa. During the early years of the Roman Empire, historical evidence also indicates the emergence of slave markets, such as the one in Leptis, which is now modern-day Libya, which served as pivotal hubs for the exchange of slaves sourced from Africa's interior. By the 5th century AD, the bustling metropolis of Carthage under Roman rule became embroiled in the trade of black slaves procured from regions across the Sahara Desert. These individuals of African descent were highly coveted as domestic servants, esteemed not solely for their labor but also for their exotic features. While certain historians theorize that the demand for slaves within the Roman Empire potentially fueled a considerable scale of trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade during ancient times might have been relatively modest and intermittent. The scale of the slave trade would reach its zenith following the introduction of significant numbers of camels by Arab and Berber traders, marking a pivotal moment in the evolution of commerce across the Sahara Desert. The slave trade persisted throughout the Middle Ages, its reach expanding with the conquest of North Africa in the early 8th century. Arab, Berber, and other ethnic groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, going through the Nile Valley towards Nubia and crossing the Sahara towards West Africa. Their primary interests lay in the trans-Saharan trade, particularly in slaves, fueled by the constant demand in the Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. Muslim slave traders differentiated themselves from the African population across the Sahara, labeling them as Zanj, or Sudan, denoting black. Acquisition of slaves often involved violent raiding, yet they could also be procured through purchases from local black rulers. While few African rulers resisted the slave trade, many chiefs engaged as middlemen, facilitating the trafficking by rounding up villages to be sold to visiting merchants. Following their capture, slaves embarked on perilous forced marches across the Sahara to reach slave markets, where they were regarded as mere commodities, subject to the whims of buyers and sellers alike. Traversing the Sahara demanded the expertise of ethnic groups uniquely adapted to the harsh, arid landscapes, the indigenous Berber tribes and the nomadic Bedouins hailing from Arabia. Various nomadic groups renowned for their survival skills in such unforgiving terrain played pivotal roles such as guards, guides and camel drivers, earning them autonomy and favour from North African governments. Despite their assistance though, the journey remained treacherous, with merchants and slaves alike facing the constant threat of death. Entire caravans, numbering in the thousands, could vanish without a trace, underscoring the ruthless and unforgiving nature of the Trans-Saharan March. The slave trade saw a diverse array of goods exchanged for the slaves. For example, traders from Morocco would transport horses, European cloths, sugar, books, and brass vessels to Sudan, trading them for slaves and gold. The roles assigned to slaves within the Trans-Saharan trade were varied. Black slaves mainly served as labourers, undertaking duties such as irrigation, mining, transportation, and construction. While some female slaves engaged in labour, many were relegated to household chores and concubinage. Yet, one of the most harrowing aspects of this trade was the widespread practice of castrating male slaves, transforming them into eunuchs. These castrated individuals, significantly more expensive than their uncastrated counterparts, would be used as harem guards, administrators, tutors, secretaries, and commercial agents. In adherence to Islamic law, castration typically occurred outside of Muslim territories, often before slaves embarked on the treacherous journey across the Sahara. During the Middle Ages, within Muslim societies, the association between blackness and slavery grew entrenched, justified through interpretations of biblical narratives, particularly the curse of Ham. According to this interpretation, Ham's supposed curse by Noah included both the darkening of his skin and the decree that his descendants would be destined for servitude. Exploiting this narrative, Muslim traders found pretext to enslave individuals of African descent, including black Muslims themselves, perpetuating a system that conflated racial identity with bondage and exploitation. This historical reality challenges modern prevailing notions that the racial dimension of the transatlantic slave trade constitutes a uniquely abhorrent evil. It highlights instead the enduring and pervasive nature of racialized exploitation throughout history. During the 16th and 17th century, Central Africa continued to experience relentless raids by slave traders. Historical estimates suggest that between the 17th and 18th century, around 1.4 million slaves were compelled to undertake the treacherous journey across the Sahara. By the 19th century, this grim trade persisted, with approximately 1.9 million more individuals enduring the brutal passage through the desert expanse. The decline of the Arab slave trade would commence in the 19th century though, spurred by various abolitionist efforts and shifting political landscapes. With the establishment of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in 1839, dedicated to combating slave trading in the Mediterranean, notable progress was made. In 1842, Ahmad ibn Mustafa, who was a ruler in Tunis, took a significant step in agreeing to prohibit the export, import, and sale of slaves, culminating in the formal abolition of slavery in 1846. Subsequently, France followed suit by outlawing slavery in their colony of Algeria in 1848. However, in Libya, the situation remained complex, as despite the official abolition of the slave trade in Tripoli in 1853, it persisted in practice. Gradually, other North African countries joined the abolition movement, albeit at different paces, with Mauritania becoming the last nation in the world to officially abolish slavery in 1981. Now that's wild. Much like many videos on history and on this channel, there is unfortunately no happy ending to this tale. Despite the media attention historical slavery gets, slavery still continues in North Africa and across the world in the modern day. Since the onset of the Libyan civil war in 2011, which led to the overthrow of a particular Libyan dictator, Libya has been besieged by rampant instability, rendering migrants without funds or documentation particularly vulnerable. Serving as a crucial exit point for African migrants en route to Europe, Libya has become a hotbed of exploitation. Many migrants originating from West Africa seeking passage to Europe find themselves ensnared by unscrupulous human traffickers or militia factions upon arrival in Libya, often falling victim to slavery. African countries south of Libya are also targeted for slave trading and transferred to Libyan slave markets. Held captive, they may be held ransom and subjected to torture and forced labour until their families can afford their release fee. In Mauritania, the situation still remains grim despite the formal abolition of slavery, as previously mentioned. According to the 2018 Global Slavery Index, an estimated 90,000 individuals, comprising 2.1% of the population at the time, were enslaved. While the Mauritanian government asserts that slavery has been eradicated and all citizens are free, African historians contend that the reality is starkly different, with a significant portion of the enslaved population being black Mauritanians held in servitude by Arab masters. Shockingly, only one individual has been prosecuted for owning slaves to date, with a lone conviction resulting in a 6-month jail sentence in January 2011. But we will explore these more pressing issues in a later video. Thank you for watching.